you want to get it bought and signed, you can do that. Book People is out there. We'll have some cookies and tea for you afterward, also just in the foyer. And so you can mingle and talk and drink tea and read books. What could be better? So welcome, Jo.
Thank you so much, Bobby.
Yes.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Before I start, let me ask, can you hear me in the back? Is the mic system working? All right, terrific. I always like to check. This is informal. I'm hoping you'll ask questions. So that's why it's really comfortable for me to just do a mic check. 32 years ago, my husband John and I welcomed our son Jeremy into the world as what we thought was our daughter. And we were wrong. He was always our son. We didn't know it. As he grew, he didn't know it because we didn't have the vocabulary, the terminology, or the understanding to help him see what was possible. So I want to back up before I start sharing more of his story and talk about a little bit of terminology. And I know that you're probably already familiar with it, but transgender is a word that can mean different things to different people. So I want to start there. And I'm going to start with our own family's definition because that's what's key to our storytelling. So as I said, when Jeremy was born, the medical community looked at his anatomy and said, this is a girl. And we gave him a girl's name. We thought we had a little girl. Over time, by the time he was in his 20s, he figured out, no, I'm a man. When someone's identity that they're given at birth doesn't match who they know themselves to be in reality, then that's being transgender. If they match, so I was identified as a girl based on my anatomy when I was born, and I am a girl, I am a woman. So I'm what's called cisgender. So those are the two categories, if you will, cisgender and transgender. And there are lots of different ways to be transgender. There's not one right way. In our son's case, it's very binary. He says, I am a man. People thought I was a woman, but I'm a man. Someone might have the opposite scenario, where they were identified as a boy at birth, and they say, nope, that's not quite right, I'm a woman. You can also have everything in between. You can have someone who says, the labels don't work. I'm neither a man or a woman, I'm both, or I'm neither, or I'm fluid, and sometimes the masculine side of me is what's front and center for me, and sometimes the feminine side. And all of these are okay. There's not a single right way to be trans. So that's kind of the terminology that I'll be using tonight. Let me also talk about why do we do this? Why do John and I travel around the country meeting with groups like you and sharing our family story? And we do that because of our belief that sharing stories is the best way to develop awareness, and that with that awareness, we will get acceptance. For most of our country's population, they think either they don't know someone who is trans, they may or they may not, or they don't know someone who's trans. And so it's this kind of an other population that they've got nothing to do with. And it's pretty easy to not trust what you don't know, to not trust people who, at least your perception is that they're different from you. So when we share our stories, we break through that barrier and we build acceptance. And we're in a great position to do it as parents, because even when people don't understand what it means to be trans, they do understand the love a parent feels for their child. We're also in a great position because Jeremy's journey, our son's journey, has been a very, very happy one. Now, it's not been easy. It's been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's a difficult decision for him to have made, to accept who he is and to act on it and to say to the world, I'm trans. took a huge amount of courage. But we get to see this joyful, exuberant, flourishing young man. And so that puts us in a good position to share his story, which really is our story as well. One last bit of background before I get into the actual stories, and that is my use of his name and pronouns. You will hear me throughout the evening saying Jeremy and he and his. He is a man, and that is his name, and those are his pronouns. It's not what we used when he was a kid. In my book, for those of you who have read it, I actually used his birth name and pronouns in the first part of the book, up until the point where he said, "My name is Jeremy, please use male pronouns." That didn't feel right to me because I knew that wasn't who he really was inside. My editor talked me into doing it this way, saying that if I jumped in at the beginning, saying he and Jeremy, I was denying my readers the opportunity to come along on the journey. And I wanted my readers to get that opportunity. This was not an easy decision to make. And the first person I asked was Jeremy. Because if he had said, "Do not use my birth name, do not use my birth pronouns," then I would not have done so. I would have found other ways to try to bring my readers along. But he was okay with it. He understood that desire. And then I turned to my fellow advocates, including members of the trans community, and I said, "Is this okay?" Because it's frowned on. It's considered impolite within the advocacy community to use someone's birth name or birth pronouns. And there was a lot of discussion about it. But in the end, folks said, "You know what? If Jeremy says it's okay, he's the one who gets to decide." And so I went with that. And that's what's in the book. But when I'm giving a talk and we only have 1 hour, we don't have the 8 hours that it takes to read the book, it feels like, well, it just couldn't come out of my mouth, that I can't describe Jeremy as she. So that's what I'm going to do this evening. I will be saying he and him, but in the stories I share, you've got a picture that the rest of the world was seeing him as she and picturing a little girl. A little girl who was a tomboy, who dressed boyishly and short hair and played all the sports and games and had all the friends that fit in with what our society thinks of as masculine. But that's just the way it was. So with that, I want to turn to back when he was only 4 years old, preschool. And at that point, John and I had wanted to have every opportunity on the table for our kids. We were children of the 60s. We grew up with the women's rights movement, and we didn't want our kids constrained by sexual stereotypes. So we offered our oldest daughter all the toys and games that were traditionally thought of as girls, and the toys and games that were traditionally thought of as boys. And almost without exception, she picked what our society thinks of as being for girls. The one exception being that she excelled immediately in sports at a time when girls in our community were not participating in sports as much. Today, that's no longer even an issue, but at the time, it still was. Then our oldest son came along. And again, we offered him all the options, and he very consistently picked all the things our society thought of as little boy. So we're starting to think, okay, maybe there's something to the stereotypes, but then Jeremy comes along, and we continued to offer everything, and now we had hand-me-downs. Hand-me-downs are, as any of you have kids, hand-me-downs are so important. And it's not only because it's saving at a time when you may be struggling to make ends meet, but there's an emotional connection as well. I would just, when I see my grandkids wearing clothes for the 2-year-old that I remember the 6-year-old wearing a few years ago, it feels good. It feels like there's this connection. So we offered Jeremy the hand-me-down clothes from his big sister. It was all very feminine. And the hand-me-down clothes from his big brother. It was all very masculine by our stereotypes. And Jeremy, time after time after time, picked the little boy clothes. He picked the little boy toys, the trucks, the balls. All his friends in the neighborhood were little boys. And we were okay with that. I was a tomboy, and I said, Jeremy's just like me, except I didn't say Jeremy, I used his birth name. And then the one thing that was different for him was his hair. So his hair was down around his shoulders at a time in Texas when little boys had very short hair, very consistently, at least in our community. And a new place opened up in town that was targeting haircuts for little boys. So they created what they thought of as a kind of little kid's man cave. And again, going with our sexual stereotypes, they had video games that the boys were attracted to. They had music that the boys were attracted to. The pictures on the walls were all boys and men and sports figures. Every stereotype that you could think of. We were in Texas, so those stereotypes were really powerful there. And that's where Jeremy wanted to go to get his haircut, because all his friends were. They were doing that. So I called him up and I said, I have a daughter, because that's what I thought I had, and will you cut her hair? The one time tonight you'll hear me say her in reference to Jeremy. And they said, yeah, sure, no problem. We're all trained in cutting any length hair. Bring your kid in. Did you notice that? I switched to saying your kid. I've learned how to describe Jeremy as a kid without using his birth pronouns. Bring your kid in and we'll cut their hair. So we get there, and sure enough, they just have Jeremy take a seat. They start working on his hair. Didn't work so well. So they may have thought they were trained in cutting longer hair, but it just wasn't looking right. And Jeremy had a real artistic sense, much better than mine. And I could see him looking in the mirror, and at 4 years old, he knew he was getting a bad haircut. And he's actually pulling on his hair on one side to make it as long as the other, and he's twisting his head around to try to make it look even, and nothing was working. So at that point, I spoke up, and I'm gonna switch over now to sharing with you a brief, a couple of paragraphs from the book, and I'm gonna do that a couple of times tonight. And even if you've read the book, it hopefully won't feel repetitive to you, just because hearing the words sometimes is very different from reading them. So I leaned into Jeremy and I said, don't worry, sweetie, I'll fix it when we get home. Jeremy trusted me. Let me stop there. I'm reading kind of from the book. I just said Jeremy trusted me. In the book, it doesn't say Jeremy, it uses his birth name. But for purposes of speaking engagements, I've actually changed what's in the book to make it more comfortable for me and more respectful for Jeremy. Jeremy trusted me. He stopped squirming in his seat, smiled at the hairdresser, and settled in to wait. The moment he was done, he jumped up and ran to the car, saying, Mommy, it's okay. You'll make it look better. I didn't know until an hour later just how prophetic his words had been. The moment we got home, we headed straight for the bathroom. I dragged my desk chair in from my study and placed it facing the mirror. Jeremy climbed up, eager to see how I was going to change his appearance. Have you ever done this before? He asked. Sure, I answered, with more confidence than I felt. Oh, I used to trim Ben's hair all the time. Ben was his big brother. What are you going to do? How do you know where to cut? Will I look like Ben when you're done? His questions tumbled out faster than I could answer, so I just went to work. I had to trim the hair really short before I could get it to look right. I don't know whether it was my inexperience with the scissors or the growing grin on Jeremy's face, but for some reason, I kept cutting. And the more I cut, the more Jeremy beamed. By the time I was done, he looked exactly like Big Brother Ben had 3 years earlier. Jeremy had a traditional boy's haircut. I didn't have the words to explain why Jeremy was ecstatic, But for the first time since becoming aware of how he looked, I could tell that he liked what he saw. Despite not understanding completely, I shared his joy. It didn't matter to me that his pleasure in looking like a boy was unusual. All I cared about as a mother was that somehow, in some way, I'd made my child happy. I'd made him happy. And that's really what we want as parents. What I didn't anticipate is what happened the next day at daycare or preschool. Preschoolers, they figure out what their friend's gender is by their hair. You have short hair, you're a boy. You have long hair, you're a girl, and also by the names. So here Jeremy shows up with a little boy haircut, and he comes home and tells me that all day at school, the kids were coming up to him and saying, wait, are you a boy or a girl? They were confused. The name didn't match the haircut. So I said, well, what did you say? And he told me that he didn't answer them. He liked that they thought maybe he was a boy. Now, if we had the kinds of discussions that we're having here tonight, if John and I had been aware, that would have been a clue. That would have been a signal that something was going on. And we could have sought help from whether it was a school counselor or the pediatrician. We could have said, maybe our kid is transgender, and been able to support him all through those years. But we didn't know. And so we couldn't help. We could love him, but we didn't understand what was going on. Now, Jeremy was okay despite that. He was a really enthusiastic, bubbly little kid. He had this circle of wonderful friends, little boyfriends who didn't care what was under his clothes. What they cared about was that he was fast and he was funny, and he laughed at their jokes, and he was good at sports. He could catch the football. He could run plays when he was 4 years old because he worshiped his big brother and wanted to be like him in every way possible. I didn't realize how many ways he wanted to be like his big brother, but I knew that when it came to sports, he couldn't get enough of it. So he played football, which was really unusual in Texas back in the 1990s. He played flag football. He was viewed as the only girl in the league, and then there was one other in this entire flag football league, and he was accepted. The other kids, they loved him because he was fun. And the group hung out together. They did sleepovers at each other's homes. We all lived fairly close together. And on any given night, all summer long, we wouldn't necessarily know going into the day where the kids were going to end up for the night. And we'd go into our family room, and by this point we would have known who was going to be there, but there'd be half a dozen kids just sprawled on the floor sleeping. And it was delightful. We'd have a barbecue, and they would rotate. They'd be at our house one night, they'd be at someone else's another night, and it was fantastic. These kids, they just were enjoying each other. And then towards the end of elementary school, we had a sleepover planned at one of the other homes, and the mom called me mid-afternoon, just before the kids were coming home from school. And she said that Jeremy, though she used the birth name, Jeremy can't stay over tonight. And my first thought was that the whole sleepover was canceled. So I'm jumping in with, hey, is there a problem? I can host it instead. The kids can all come here. I know it's last minute, but fine with that. And she said, no, we're having the sleepover at my house, but your kid has to go home at 11. Can you come pick them up? And I was confused, though I should have anticipated it. And she said, Emily, it's the one time you're going to hear me say the birth name, Emily is too old to spend the night with the boys. Well, I did know that that was eventually going to happen, but I didn't expect it to happen as early as it did. None of them had hit puberty. It was still totally innocent. And when Jeremy came home from school and I had to tell him that the evening was canceled, he was devastated. His social life had ended like that. This circle of friends that had been with him since he was 3 years old all of a sudden was starting to exclude him. Because once one mom said, you can't do it, all the moms said you can't do it. And once the moms were saying you can't hang out with the boys after dark, the boys were saying you can't hang out with us. And it was heartbreaking to see this kid who had been so incredibly happy and bubbly as a preschooler and then an elementary school kid, to see him start shutting down. And that's what happens with trans kids a lot. And at the same time that they're hitting puberty and dealing with being very frustrated with their bodies and disappointed that they're going through a puberty that they don't want, but they don't understand why it doesn't seem right to them, they're having to deal with their friends not wanting them, not treating them the same. And it was tough. So going back to the book where I'm able to capture some of Jeremy's own words. This is before football practice. By this time, he had gone on to tackle football. He was viewed as the only girl in the history of the school to play football both years. And he would say, I'm not playing to make a statement, because he was getting congratulated as a woman's right representative. He said, I play because I like it. This isn't political. This is where I feel at home. It's when I'm playing football. When we're on the field and suited up, my teammates forget that I'm a girl. With my shoulder pads and helmet, I don't look any different from them, and we're all caught up in the game. But I feel left out because we're no longer friends off the field. I thought 6th grade was tough, but 7th grade is even worse when it comes to not fitting in. One day we were hanging out before practice, waiting for the coaches to show up. I walked to a group of guys who were laughing together. When I got there, though, they went all quiet. Whatever they were talking about, they didn't want to discuss it in front of me. So I climbed into the stands to sit alone, thinking it's okay that they don't want me around. I can deal. But I couldn't. I couldn't make the feeling go away. My throat hurt and my chest tightened, and I felt isolated and deserted as I thought about how long it had been since I'd hung out with my teammates like when we were little kids. I no longer had a social life. Well, middle school is tough for everybody, but it's even tougher when you're transgender. The boys didn't know what to think of him, and the girls didn't know what to think of him. He didn't fit in with anybody. And it just kept getting worse. And in high school, he really didn't have friends to go hang out with. He still played sports, but he didn't even know his teammates. He'd fit in on the football team with all the boys, but he didn't feel like he fit in on the softball team with all the girls. So he didn't become friends with them. Now, John and I didn't know what was happening, because what Jeremy did was throw himself into school activities as kind of a way of covering up and making up for having lost all his friends. He played every sport he possibly could. He actually won an award as the best all-around female athlete when he was finishing up middle school. And he felt so torn, because on the one hand, he loved that recognition, and he'd worked his tail off to get that recognition, but it felt wrong, because he was already knowing, even if he didn't have the words to describe it, that he wasn't a girl. In the same way, if we said he was beautiful, he liked the attention, he liked the praise, but it felt wrong, because somehow inside he knew that what he wanted to be, what he would prefer to be, was handsome. So he threw himself into sports. He threw himself into the art club and became the president of the art club. He played in the school band. He was on the drum line, and so he marched at the football games and sometimes through the halls at the school. And we thought that he was having a great time, and we thought he was popular, and we were oblivious. So after a while, we noticed that he hadn't started dating Our older kids, by the time they were in high school, they were just all over the dating scene. They were talking about girls, talking about boys, going out on dates, and Jeremy, it was nothing. And so I asked him at one point, you think it's possible that you're gay? So I was thinking, okay, if he's a lesbian, which he wasn't, but if he was, then maybe he was in the closet, even to himself, and so not wanting to interact with girls, even though girls would hit on him. And he told me, no, I'm just not attracted to anybody. And when we got home, that conversation was in the car, and here I think I'm being the real cool mom for initiating this conversation. That wasn't the way Jeremy thought of it. I was not the real cool mom as far as he was concerned. So he gets home and he's talking with his siblings, because you won't believe what Mom asked me today. She asked if I'm gay. And Jeremy, was expecting his siblings to go, yeah, Mom's really crazy. And instead they said, well, what did you say? And looking back on it, Jeremy says that was the first time he realized that he was coming across to other people as somehow different. And this is true often for trans kids. When you don't know who you are yourself, it's hard to figure out who you're attracted to. So for years, Jeremy just said, I'm not attracted to anybody. And that was actually the hardest thing for me as mom, because I saw him as being alone and never having a partner. He said he was never going to have children. And that was very disheartening for me, because I ached for him, I hurt for him. I wanted for him what I so enjoyed myself. But we moved past that, and it wasn't until he was in his 20s, really, that he started presenting as very androgynously. He got comfortable with having his hair quite short all the time, and he basically dressed the way he wanted to dress, which made him look like a man, except that he had a feminine body shape, and he liked that, but he was uncomfortable with the shape. He liked the clothes, he liked the hair, not the shape. And so he read up on it and said, what I need to do is have what's called top surgery. And you may have heard of that, but what it means essentially is for a transgender man, it's when they have a double mastectomy and some shaping that goes along with that to give them a flat profile, a man's chest. He wasn't saying he was trans, he wasn't saying he was a man, but he said, my chest is wrong, I'm supposed to be flat. And so he was thinking about surgery, but he didn't tell the family. We didn't know yet. John and I were starting to suspect that this might be the case, but we didn't know for sure. And then something happened that brought it all to a head. And that was that his big sister was getting married and asked him to be her maid of honor. And Jeremy said yes, thrilled that his sister felt close enough to him to bestow this honor on him, and didn't think about the fact that being a maid of honor is kind of one of the most feminine things you can do. And then as time went on and the wedding got closer and his big sister picked out a gown, a maid of honor gown for him to wear, he was feeling worse and worse and worse. And he hadn't worn a dress in years by this time, and the thought made him feel terrible. And I'm going to share with you one last reading, and this is in his voice, how he was feeling about the upcoming wedding. I'd dreaded its arrival for months. When the box came, I'd left it unopened, not wanting to deal with what it contained. I tried to push it out of my mind, tried to ignore how it made my stomach clench with anxiety. I didn't even want to think about the dress inside, let alone look at it. Why had I said yes when my big sister Liz asked me to be her maid of honor? I'd known right away that it felt wrong. But the thought of disappointing Liz kept me awake at night, a rock in the pit of my stomach. Picturing myself wearing the bridesmaid dress, though, was even worse. Finally, 6 weeks before the wedding, I opened the box, determined to look at what lay inside. Inhaling deeply and gritting my teeth, I slowly reached for the blue chiffon gown. I pulled it from its packaging and spread it out on my bed. All I had to do was try it on. I could do that, I told myself, wincing at the thought I should do that. But not yet. I'd wait until I got home from school. All day, with every word of every lecture, my mind drifted back to my bedroom, to that dress waiting for me. Arriving home after class, I walked slowly into my bedroom. My pulse racing, I stripped down and slipped the dress over my head. On somebody else, I would have thought it beautiful, no question, but not on me. I cringed at the thought of wearing it in front of everybody. I cringed because that flowing dress was so totally and completely inappropriate for me. It was the exact opposite of what I like, of who I am. I'm not feminine, and I don't want to look that way. My throat tightened as I felt my eyes tear up in frustration. Deciding to face my anxiety head on, I stood in front of my mirror and looked at the person staring back. I shuddered at my reflection, at the tightly fitting bodice that pushed up and magnified my breasts, accentuating every curve. I hunched my shoulders forward, trying to make my shape less noticeable, but it didn't work. My reflection smiled back at me, but it was a sad smile. Leaving the safety of my room, I walked over to where my roommate was sitting in his usual spot in our living room. I raised my arms and spun around, allowing him to take it all in. Seeing the devastation on my face, he finally spoke. "You have to tell her. You're tearing yourself apart." He was right. I couldn't think of anything else. I hate my body. I have ever since puberty, when there was no avoiding that my body was turning into a woman. I'm not supposed to have curves on my hips and breasts. I'm supposed to be flat. I know that. I just have no idea what to say to my big sister. Well, in this same time frame, Jeremy shared with us that he was thinking about the surgery. What he didn't share was he'd actually already scheduled it. But we knew at least that he was thinking about it, and I begged him to tell his big sister. And I said, "She'll understand. You don't have to wear that dress." But he was so adamant that he didn't want to disappoint her, that he wouldn't say anything for the longest time. But as it got closer, he said, I can't wear the dress. I can't do it. And he didn't tell his sister why, but he told her that he couldn't wear the dress. And he said, "But I have another idea. Let's see if you like it. How about if I wear the same slacks as all the groomsmen and a white dress shirt, a man's dress shirt, and I'll have a vest made from the same material as the bridesmaid's dress." And his big sister didn't understand, but she said, "Okay." And we got to the wedding, and Jeremy looked adorable. And he stood by his sister's side, and no one thought twice about it. They just said, "He is so cute." And later he told us that when people said that to him, he was like, no, I want to be handsome. But this mom is saying he was cute. And you'll see, you're going to see a video with him in a few minutes. Well, the wedding happened, and then Jeremy shared with his siblings and with us that he had scheduled the surgery for just a few months from then. But we had another big family event before the surgery was going to happen, and that was his big brother was getting married. And his brother's fiance, now my daughter-in-law, said, "We got the same issue. Jeremy was going to be one of the bridesmaids." And so they didn't wait for Jeremy to say anything. My oldest son and his fiance called Jeremy up and said, "We know you don't want to wear the dress. We're going to get you the same suit that all the groomsmen are wearing, and don't stand with the bridesmaids. Come stand by me, his big brother was saying, "Come be by my side." Again, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know why this was so important to him, but his siblings accepted him. And that meant so much. Jeremy and I started giving talks even before the book came out, and we would go and visit communities, and like we're doing this evening, and share his story. And sometimes he'll go with me. And this one time, we were speaking to a group of college students and young adults. And I guess college students are young adults, but so college students and somewhat older young adults. And one of them came up to us afterwards and said, "Thank you for not wearing the dress." And at first we weren't sure what he meant. And he said, "That was me. When I was first figuring out who I am, my sister had asked me to be the maid of honor, and I wore the dress. And I was miserable every second, and I hated it, and I knew I wasn't being true to myself, but I didn't have the courage. So when I hear about you standing first with your sister and then with your brother, not wearing the dress, I'm living vicariously through you, and I just feel so proud and so happy." So it was a huge step that Jeremy took, but he still wasn't saying, "I'm trans." He was saying, "I have physical gender dysphoria," which means that he felt anxiety and depression. For some people, the dysphoria is so bad that they have suicide ideation. 40% of transgender teens have tried to die by suicide. That's 10 times the number of our teens in general. Gender dysphoria is really, really hard. And Jeremy was working through all of that. Well, he had his surgery, and he just loved the way his chest looked after that. And he was beaming, and more often people were seeing him as a man. We went out for dinner with his younger brother and his dad and me, and the waitress came over and took John's and my drink orders, and then turned to Jeremy and his little brother Sammy and said, "And what do you boys want?" Well, Jeremy was just beaming. He loved it when people assumed he was a man. So he said, "You know what? I need to explore this some more." And with the help of a really excellent therapist, over the course of several months, he came to terms with being trans. And we knew this was happening a little bit after the fact. We didn't know he had gone into therapy to do this, but we knew he was thinking about it. And we were encouraging him. We'd been doing our research. We actually were ahead of him. And John said, "You know, if you want to go on hormones, that's okay." And he said to his little brother, I can't believe they're the ones suggesting it instead of the other way around. But we didn't know when he was going to say anything, but he did on Facebook. That was how we found out. And he did a posting that basically said, "Hey guys, you might have noticed I've got a new Facebook profile. My picture's different, my name is different. Please start using male pronouns. And by the way, in 2 weeks, I'm going to start hormones, and I'm going to go through a male puberty. My voice will deepen. Hopefully, I'll grow some facial hair. That's it. Bye." And that was it. He was out. Well, I was already a writer at this point, and I had in my mind, I already knew how I wanted to share with my circle of friends once Jeremy was ready. Because until that point, it wasn't my story to tell. I couldn't get ahead of him. But once he posted, I did my own posting in which I repeated the basic information that he had said, and then added to it how proud we are of Jeremy and how much courage it took, and how he was the bravest person we know for having accepted his authentic self and told his circle of friends about it and posted on Facebook. And I closed with saying, "We have been with you every step of the way, and we will continue by your side wherever your journey takes you." Well, I posted that, and we started getting responses immediately. I had a much wider Facebook following than Jeremy did as a published writer, and just being older, I had a wider circle of friends. So the responses started coming in, and from family, from the whole extended family, we were hearing congratulations. You know, you be you, Jeremy. I'm so proud of you. This is fantastic. Or it all makes sense now. Was one of my favorites. And then it went viral. My posting did, and I started hearing from people I'd never met, friends of friends of friends, Facebook messages saying that it was so nice to see such an accepting mom. And you know, I'm patting myself on the back saying, oh yeah, way to go, good mom here. And that felt great. Then the messages started getting darker. And I started hearing from young transgender men who related to Jeremy. And they told me that when they had come out to their families, they'd been kicked out, 15, 16 years old, living on the street. That was heartbreaking. And as John and I realized that, we said, we've got to do something more. And with Jeremy's permission, we became advocates. Going back to one of the things I said before, as parents, we were in a great position to speak out and to try to build awareness and acceptance. So picture the timing of this. It's 2015 in Texas. The Texas politicians were starting to put forth these anti-transgender bills that they were trying to pass into law that basically were going to deny the ability of trans people to exist in public spaces by not letting them use bathrooms. One of our politicians, when presented with an individual who was a trans man and was a tall individual, had a full beard, had a deep voice, and the individual said, do you really want me going into the women's restroom? I don't want to do that because I'll make people uncomfortable. And the politician responded, no, I don't want you doing that. And he said, well, where do I go then? And he said, stay home. Stay home. And then they started coming after the transgender children and saying that the schools couldn't support kids being trans. And we'd hear stories from friends, from fellow advocates about kids that were getting sick because they just wouldn't use the facility all day because it didn't feel right to them what they were being required to do. And even if they were offered to go use the nurse's office with a bathroom there, which was an answer that a lot of schools came up with, it still isolated the kid. When the kid goes across campus to the nurse's office, everybody knows what they're doing and why. And so the kids just wouldn't do anything, and then they'd get bladder infections. And we saw this happening, so we started going to the state capitol and joining others at rallies and in speaking to the politicians and going door to door and saying, this is what a family looks like with a trans kid. We are just people. And we just want our son to be happy. Well, we got hooked up with Equality Texas, who listened to our story and said, we'd like to make a video, a 30-second spot that we can air as part of the campaign against these bills that are being proposed. We said, sure. They sent a professional team of former TV broadcasters, TV cameramen, to interview us for what we thought was going to be half an hour, from which they'd put together a 30-second spot. Well, we ended up connecting so with this group of people. They were just so incredibly marvelous and asked such great questions that we ended up spending the entire afternoon together, and they put together a 6-minute video, which they then aired as part of their advocacy work. And we're going to share it with you tonight now. So Carl, if you've got it lined up, 6 minutes, and you get to see Jeremy not just as he was a few years ago, but as he was as a kid.
I'm terrified of change. And the only thing I'm almost more scared of is the only thing I'm more scared of is you know, not changing. I'm frozen right now.
Jeremy Ivester is a transgender man.
Today I wanted to talk about gender dynamics. Raising awareness is key.
Who has chronicled his transition over the years with a video diary.
I had too much to say, and I was not very fast at typing. And so I would just record myself.
His mother, Jo Ivester, is writing a book called Once a Girl, Always a Boy, about her son's journey.
I've said to Jeremy, I would like to make your story my next book. Can I have your permission to write about you? Because I think that we can make a difference. Jeremy's journey had been full of joy. It's something that other families need to see. If we can use our personal story as a way of building awareness, that will contribute to acceptance.
The mother and son are writing the book together.
I was already thinking about my own gender identity.
Jo is using Jeremy's video journal as his voice in the book.
He's continued to make his videos.
It was a very jarring transition for me from elementary school to middle school.
Sometimes he just talks about whatever subject he's picked. Sometimes I'll send him an email and say, hey, can you talk about what it was like playing football in middle school?
I was a receiver in flag football.
Or give him some other topic. And sometimes we'll sit down together in front of the computer and I'll interview him.
We'd rollerblade, we would play football in the yard. I was definitely one of the guys, but I would just wish that I would wake up a boy.
It was in middle school where Jeremy noticed he didn't fit in with his peers anymore.
I lost my social group because all the little boys that I had grown up playing with just couldn't handle hanging out with a girl. They didn't know how to treat me. Here I am just so confused because I didn't understand why I couldn't continue to fill this role that I'd filled my entire life. The girls weren't really any better. They were perfectly happy to let me sit with them at lunch, but as soon as they wanted to talk about anything personal, as soon as they wanted to gossip or talk about their bodies, or I don't actually know what they talked about because they would literally send me away. And they'd make me leave because I was too much like a boy, and somehow that meant that I would betray their secrets.
Jeremy, from a very early age, wanted to associate with boys and do boys' things, and we didn't think a lot of that because we were trying to raise a child that was not, that had all options open to the child and not constrained by, gender expectations.
When Jeremy was 18, he had a heart-to-heart talk with his parents, telling them he was not gay or straight. It wasn't until he was about to turn 24 that he realized he was transgender.
It's so ridiculous that at the time I couldn't just say what I was feeling, but I was terrified of disappointing people. And had more people known that transgender was a thing, they would have seen signs and said, hey, if you want to do this, you can do that. And I would have been like, yeah.
The hardest part has been recognizing that we could have given Jeremy more in his adolescence than we did. As open and understanding as we tried to be as parents, we did not have the knowledge, the awareness, the understanding to help him see as a child, as a teenager, who he is. And it's an opportunity lost.
Jeremy really has always been a good person, has always been a righteous person, has always cared about people and wanted to do the right thing. But the happiness was always a little bit of a question. And now he seems very, very comfortable because the source of his unhappiness was just that he was uncomfortable with himself.
I think it's really important to show that transition doesn't have to be this life or death situation. It can be so happy and so joyful and this really positive experience.
At age 27, Jeremy is now embracing his authentic self with confidence and joy.
I can't regret my life. All of it has shaped me to be the person I am. And I think I am more empathetic and more accepting and more loving because of the amount of self-reflection I've had to do to figure out what's going on. I think self-reflection is really powerful. Understanding yourself is really powerful.
The weight that seems to be off of Jeremy's shoulders once he made the decision and went through the transition has been just delightful to watch.
Seeing how joyful Jeremy is now that he can live his life the way he wants to live it, look the way he wants to look, be the man he wants to be. There is so much joy tied to that. That's the best part.
Discrimination is not a Texas value. Embrace dignity and respect for every Texan. Join Equality Texas.
You can see why I am so proud of my son. He is courageous, he is kind, he is everything that a parent wants in their kid and for their kid. And he has flourished in the 5 years since this video was made. He came to terms with his sexual orientation. And instead of saying, I'm asexual, I'm not interested in anybody, he's figured out he's gay. And he now has a boyfriend. And it's just, this whole time has been incredibly rewarding. And I love the opportunity to come and share with a group like you folks because I want to share that joy. And my hope is, my ask is that in whatever way is comfortable for you, you will become an advocate as well. And that can be, and I know that you already are through the League of Women Voters, but when it comes to the transgender community, it can be something as small and personal as in a conversation. If someone cracks a joke where the whole point of the joke is, oh, and someone is transgender, ha, you say, wait a minute, that's not a joke. Transgender people are not a joke. And just speak up, say, I know someone who has a trans son. And they deserve the same acceptance and dignity and respect that we all do. And it can be voting. I know that's for the community sitting in this room, that's so key. And it's not just the statewide or the national positions, it's the school boards. In Texas, that's something that we're fighting for so passionately because our school boards are being taken over by individuals who are trying to wipe the LGBT community off the face of the education system. And so voting for people, if you're financially inclined to donate to organizations that are trying to protect the rights of trans people. Here in Washington State, it's wonderful because the state has a non-discrimination policy. And so people like my son are protected. But we still need to make sure that the policies are followed. And so to be aware of that. So whatever is comfortable for you as an advocate, I just ask that at this point, you'll now say, I understand more, I accept more, and maybe I can do more. So thank you so much for inviting me into your community tonight. And I hope that this has opened your eyes on some issues, or if you already were very aware of the trans community, if you've got a family member or have someone dear to you who is trans, I hope that you found this inspiring and just a little bit helpful. So thank you very much. And with that, I know I've already used up our hour, but we do have time for Q&A for anybody who wants to stay, and then I'll
we
sign
can go
some books
2
for
hours.
anybody who wants to do that. We've got a microphone here, so if you've got a question, raise your hand, and Bobby will come around with the mic.
I don't have a question. I have perhaps some good news, but I have to find it because I want to get it right. Today, my family sent a little note that said, sorry, it must be in a different, here we go. Montana judge blocks anti-trans birth certificate rule.
I'm sorry, could you maybe move your mask down?
Montana judge blocks anti-trans birth certificate rule. So the state of Montana, as I understand it, was trying to make it so that you had to identify
Yes.
as your birth certificate, and
And
a judge in
knocked
Montana.
that down. That's
blocked it.
fantastic. That is fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Any other comments? Okay.
Last week, we were on campus registering voters and introducing the league to the campus community. And a young person came up and he wanted to fill out a registration form. And on the form was gender. And he didn't know, he, she, I'm not sure which way they're going in
How
the
they
transition, said, I'm a he in federal papers, a she on state papers. What do I put down here? And although I had to ask later, it's optional to put down anything under the gender section on a voter registration forms. And essentially our position was, well, you can be anything you want.
I love it.
And he goes, okay, I'm going to put trans down. So that's my
That's
story.
terrific. And that's
Thanks,
support. It's so hard for a trans person when they're filling out paperwork. I've been to physicians' offices, for example, and their paperwork says, well, you have to say, are you male or female? And for a trans person, that's really hard to deal with, because on the one hand, your doctor, depending on what kind of doctor it is, needs to know to provide the proper medical care. On the other hand, in many cases, the doctor doesn't need to know. And why should it become an issue? So we actually have a group in Texas that's trying to work with physicians' offices as to how to create paperwork for patient intake that provides that same freedom to specify whatever you want to specify. And then in an interview, in a history, they can do it.
In one place, he listed one, another place, another thing.
Yeah,
And it was like, we have to simplify the system and make it.
we do. And Jeremy, thinking about the medical, he ran into difficulty with his hormones. So his first doctor that worked with him to get him on hormones was incredibly supportive, knew everything about trans health, and that's kind of what got Jeremy launched. Then he changed jobs and he changed his health care, and all of a sudden he's going to a Kaiser clinic, and he doesn't know anything about the doctors that are there. He's been assigned a doctor, so he just goes to that doctor, and he's really scared that the doctor will not understand anything about the trans community from a medical perspective, or that will want to mess with his prescription. And he was delighted when the doctor basically said, okay, I'm not experienced with this, you're my first trans patient, but I'm willing to learn, and you seem to be thriving, so I'm just going to continue the prescription that you're on. And the doctor went to enter that into the computer, and the computer wouldn't let him. So even though the doctor was really supportive, the computer looked at Jeremy's medical history, where he'd been entered as female, and said, you can't prescribe testosterone to a woman, which actually isn't even true, but someone had programmed the computer system to put up a red flag. And so the doctor said, okay, what I'm going to do, don't worry about it, I'm going to change your gender in the system. And he changed the F to an M, and then the computer let him prescribe the testosterone. And the doctor said, but you realize that if at some point in the future you want to get a hysterectomy, which a lot of trans men will do, sometime in the first 5 years or so, it's often medically advised. He said, we're going to have to change it back, because I think this computer system will not let me prescribe a hysterectomy for a man. And it's kind of funny, and I've told it as if it's funny, but it shows that even when individuals are trying to be supportive, the systems sometimes just aren't. And we need to fix that. He ran into the same problem with renting an apartment. He found an apartment that he desperately wanted. It was in a building that was in a neighborhood that prided itself on gay acceptance. It was actually referred to as the Gayborhood. That was how the neighborhood referred to itself, in a building that gave for free office space to the Gay Chamber of Commerce. That's how supportive they were. So Jeremy fills out the application with his new name and his only social security number, because he's changed all the paperwork, submits it, and the credit company, the credit monitoring company, says, fraud, we've got 2 names and 1 social security number. Well, the folks in the office, in the rental office, they were trying to be supportive. And they said, but our rules won't let us rent to you when your credit record is coming up as fraudulent. And so Jeremy essentially had to out himself to the staff at this apartment building and apply for the apartment under his birth name. And he'd been so looking forward to having moved to a new city where no one was going to know his past and he could just be Jeremy. And just getting his apartment, it got blown. And it's just not right. They wanted to be supportive, the computer system wouldn't let them. So we're gradually getting these changes made. We fight, we make it happen, then we lose ground and have to keep fighting again. So we do it. Other questions? Or comments, thoughts? Tell you what, I'm going to stick around as long as anybody wants to talk. We've got some books in the front. I'm very happy to sign them, to personalize them. And again, just thank you so much for inviting me to join you this evening. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you.
Before you all exit, would you just stay put so I can get a good picture of this for our next newsletter or whatever we need it for the League of Women Voters. So thank you so much. Don't turn around. It'll only be the back of your head. And Joe. Thank you so much. Good job. That was wonderful. Thank you.